Kelly, perspectives from my journey. I'll be chatting today with Shachar Liran-Hanan, who you can see on your screen. Welcome, Shachar. Shachar is the new senior Shliha to Westchester for Jaffe, the Jewish Agency for Israel. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on Shachar before we begin. Just before coming to Westchester, Shachar served as the Director of International Business Development at Shekulo Tov, the leading vocational rehab service provider in Israel, building its international partner network and promoting global inclusion. Her journey into the Jewish world started right after she was born, technically, but right after she finished her military duty. She started volunteering for the Jewish Agency, first at Camp Ramah in the Berkshires, and later as a shliha for the Jewish community in Durban, South Africa. This road led her to join Stand With Us, the well-known international Israel education organization, leading the Stand With Us fellowship program in public diplomacy for students all across Israel. In 2015, following Operation Protective Edge, Shachar was appointed as the CEO of My Truth, a grassroots nonprofit comprised of IDF reserve soldiers who seek to share the moral dilemmas Israeli soldiers face on the battlefield, relating their personal experiences and ethical challenges to a global audience on college campuses, in parliaments, mainstream and social media, and more. Shachar is still an active officer in the IDF reserves, training soldiers and teaching them on the geopolitical background of their combat missions. She has her MBA in social leadership through a joint program of Ben-Gurion University and the Mandel Foundation, and earned her BA degree, a double major in psychology and education, also from Ben-Gurion University. She is married to Elroy, whom she met at Camp Ramah 12 years ago, and they are proud parents of Kerem, Lotem, and Mensch the dog. After Shachar and I chat, we will take questions from you, our studio audience. Please use your chat window on Zoom to let us know if you have a question, and let us begin. Welcome, Shachar. Thanks for joining us and allowing us to get a little personal with you today.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. How are you, and how are you enjoying living here now in the United States?
I'm loving it, honestly. I mean, ever since we arrived, we've felt so welcome and loved and supported by the Jewish community all across Westchester. This community and its love for Israel, it's unbelievable for me and can literally make me tear up in the middle of the day, just like that. So I'm definitely very happy to be here, in this position. I don't think I could have asked for any better fit of a community to me and my family, and our the way that we see the shlichut, and we're probably going to talk more about it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I also want to use this opportunity to thank anybody who made this journey possible. Definitely the Jewish Agency for Israel, UJA, were huge partners of the shlichut all across New York, and absolutely WJC, that's the best partners I could have asked for here in Westchester. So thank you.
You are very, very welcome. And let me just say, before we go any further, now I know our objective here is to tear you up, but before I do go further, I do want to point out to everybody who may not realize that you may have the most optimistic, happy Hebrew name combination that you can imagine. Shachar Liran-Hanan, I always like thinking about the meaning of names, literally means dawn of my joyful gift, or at least that's my interpretation. Wow. Now, I know you did mention something to me about the significance of your own family name, Liran, which I know you want to address. We'll get into that a little bit later on when we get to your family history, so I won't let you forget that. But just on the topic, away from the practical side of your shlichut role, when we first spoke, we were talking about what you might talk about. And it occurred to us that well beyond your role as a shlicha in our midst, that you had something else, I think, very important to impart. And we landed on quite a provocative title, which at its core is really all about identity. And the title, again, to repeat it, is, am I a Jew or am I an Israeli? And tell us, is there an answer to this question? Does there need to be? Is there indeed a difference? We're in a world where others are certainly seeking to separate Zionism from Judaism and vice versa. So what have you experienced, and where do you stand?
I think it's a fascinating question. I think that for me, growing up in Israel, I never faced this question, really. If you would have asked me this question back in my high school days, I could have given you the most simple answer. I'm an Israeli, period. Judaism was never part of my Jewish identity growing up. And, living in Israel, it was kind of taken for granted. In Israel, you're a Jew by nature. You don't necessarily need to choose that definition or that's part of your identity per se. And I think that the first time that I actually encountered this question about myself and about my personal identity was when I came here on Ramah summer camp in the Berkshires, where I guess this is really where my journey into my Jewish identity started. Not really when I was born to a Jewish mother or in a Jewish country.
Well, good. Well, let's pick up from there. So we're going to get to Camp Ramah, but then let's start with that. Let's talk about family and history and genealogy. What has been your path? And let's maybe start with your parents and your grandparents and even great grandparents, because it's a very interesting story about, where do you come from and who are you? You talk about your mom and your dad and.
Sure. So, the fact that I was brought up to be only an Israeli, not a Jew, definitely comes from my family background. My dad's family comes from Eastern Europe, and my grandmother is a Holocaust survivor who was born in the town of Rovno, back in Poland. Now it's part of the Ukraine. And through the journey that she's been through during Second World War, she managed to get to Israel. My grandfather, my dad's dad, made Aliyah in 1936 and was actually sent back to Europe to bring, as a shaliach on behalf of the Jewish Agency for Israel, to bring Holocaust survivors to Israel. And even though he came from Rovno as well, from the same town where my grandmother was born and raised, they never met, and this is how they met. And eventually he was the one to bring her and her family to Israel, and a couple of years later marry her and brought 2 sons. One of them is my father, and the other is his older brother. My mom's side, on the other hand, is it's much more rooted within Israel. My mother's side is actually 8th generation in Israel, with long heritage of building the country.
Yeah, I want you to skip over that. I want you to repeat that. 8th generation.
Yes.
That's fascinating. And before that, do we know from where?
There are, it's also, it's branched out. So she does have some relations to Turkey and Romania and Poland as well, but also very much rooted in Israel. And my mom's dad was born and raised in Poland, but actually came to Israel through Romania. And later on, in his professional path, he did a whole career in the IDF Navy after joining the Haganah before the establishment of Israel, and reached to the level of the deputy commander of the Navy in Israel. So also Sabra is exactly the way to describe my mother's side of the family, whether they were born in here or not. And a family were always in Israeli kibbutzim, the most hardcore kibbutzim that you can imagine. I remember growing up doing holidays in kibbutz Mizra and Sarid, where I have family, which are the 2 only kibbutzim in Israel who grow pigs in the territory, which is basically illegal in Israel, but they found creative ways to grow them on platforms, so that they could eat pork, basically.
Okay, fascinating. So 8th generation on your mom's side, your dad, European heritage, Holocaust lineage. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing. You described that you were basically brought up in an atheist environment. Here you're sharing with us that they were, the kibbutzim were raising pigs in a very clever, creative fashion. And yet you had the calendar, the Israeli calendar, the Jewish calendar. So tell us for a minute about holidays. What were Jewish holidays? Were there Jewish holidays, or were they Israeli holidays, and how were they celebrated? Let's tick off a few.
It's an interesting question. I guess that in Israel, obviously we celebrate the Jewish holidays, but where I grew up, it didn't have any Jewish context. Celebrating Passover and in Mizrach, for example, we had a whole celebration. We even had the Agadah there, but the Agadah of the kibbutzim movement has no presence of God in it. So it's a very secular kind of heritage book, I guess, that you can learn a lot from about the kibbutzim movement in Israel. And when we celebrated Passover at home, actually, we didn't even read the Agadah. We didn't have any kind of, the traditional Passover symbols. We had pitot on the set of plates, not egg and regel and fish head or anything like that.
But pita can look a little like matzah. It's not, but it looks like
no, all comes from flour at the end of the day, but really no sense of tradition in my family. No kiddush on Friday night, no lighting the candles. These are all things and traditions that I learned later in my life. Definitely not from the home where I was raised.
So what was the holy day then? What was the holy day that was celebrated in the house?
The holiest day that we had in my family, the one that my mother would never let any of us miss, wherever we might be, in college, in the army, wherever, is actually Yom Ha'atzmaut. It wasn't a religious family in any way, but it was an extremely Zionist family for sure. So Yom Ha'atzmaut is something that we observed very strictly, I would say. And other holidays like Sukkot and Shavuot had, again, no religious context, but a very Israeli context. Sukkot wasn't the one of the regalim. It wasn't celebrated the way that we alinu to Jerusalem. We went to Jerusalem, but we celebrated the Chag HaAsif, where we collect our grains and we celebrate the land and its production. And same about Shavuot. It's a huge festival in agricultural area, and I grew up in the Israel Valley, an extremely agricultural area. I mean, that was a big part of my childhood scenery, I guess. So this was the holiday seasons.
That's fascinating that the holidays, even as you describe them, were structured is still in a very sort of biblical way, the way the nature was, and we still refer to Shavuot and Sukkot in those same ways as well, albeit they have the sort of more temple-oriented, Jewish sort of holiday-oriented side of them as well. So let me ask you then, growing up in Israel, did you have any friends at all that had more of a traditional Jewish upbringing from yours, or were you fairly segregated? And was there anything in Israel before you came to the States where you began to wonder more about the Jewish part of you, maybe through the lens of other friends, or not?
So I remember having one friend in the town that I grew up in that her mother light Shabbat candles. And that's the most I can recall. And I remember her family, her parents fasting on Yom Kippur, which was something that I never experienced in my family. So on the one hand, definitely I grew up in an extremely secular, not to say atheist, environment. On the other hand, I think that I had something within me that always kind of pushed me towards that direction. I mean, I remember myself fasting on Yom Kippur since I was 12, while nobody in my family did. So my mom still wonder where did I brought it from, maybe from that one friend, I'm not sure. But that was something that was really important for me. And when I finished high school, and I always knew that I'm going to go on a gap year because it's something that Israeli kids who are socially active kind of go to that direction pretty easily before they go to the army. So I was looking to a gap year where I can be meaningful and volunteer in a meaningful way. But eventually I went to a pre-army mechina that had a Jewish secular aspect in it. I mean, to develop your secular Jewish identity in a way that would support your social activism and your leadership role within the Israeli social society. Yeah, I guess that was my first kind of initial steps towards that direction of understanding my Jewish identity.
And obviously your perceptions have changed over time, but let's touch on, when was the first time you came to the US though? It wasn't as a shliha, or was it? I don't recall. Did you come at a younger age at one point, or really only later on as a professional?
So I came to the US a few times on family trips and just traveling. But the most meaningful time that really changed my life was when I came as a shliha on a summer camp on Ramah Berkshires. And I can't forget, I mean, the first week there, where I sat there on, in front of this beautiful lake, surrounded by so many Jewish kids, much younger than me, from all kind of background. I mean, some were kippot and some were talitot and some keep kosher and some keep Shabbat and some speak Hebrew. But they all feel much more Jewish than me. They can say the brachot by heart. They can pray without really speaking Hebrew fluently. They know the Birkat HaMazon. They have some kind of connection to this greater global Jewish community, which I was never exposed to even. And I got a lot of inspiration from there. In Israel, I always felt that that you need to make this definite choice, whether you are a religious Jew or a secular Jew. And if you're a religious Jew, it's a whole package that you need to hold. I mean, that you keep Shabbat and you keep kosher and you light the candles and you pray 3 times a day and you're part of a community and you go to shul regularly. Or the exact opposite, that you do none of it and that the shul is nothing that relates to you. And the Jewish books are not something that is part of your tradition. In my school, we learned Bible, but it was more it was similar to literature, not as a kind of tradition that is connected to us in any way. So coming to Ramah, I remember sitting in the first week, kind of an orientation staff week. I was sitting in that tefillot with a notebook, writing notes to myself on the prayers and on the text, and what do I think about them, and what does it mean when God is sometimes referred literally as a male or female, and how do I feel about it, and so many other questions that I really met for the first time in my life.
Yeah, that must have been quite an eye-opener for you. So you're at Ramah. Did your own Jewish exploration and practice change sort of that very summer? Did it sort of evolve more over time? Did you make any conscious decision of your own at that time to pursue more of something?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, Ramah was a life-changing experience for me. I only then got aware of my own definition as a Jew, and what it means to me and where I want this to be present within my life. And coming back from there, knowing Birkat HaMazon now, and what it is, and Havdalah and what it means, I started kind of adopting different traditions to my own secular life. So definitely that was the first step in this journey, but not the last. later on, I went on the Shlichut in South Africa, as you mentioned. I lived in Durban, where the Jewish community is very, very small, and there I started keeping kosher for the first time, because I wanted to be part of this community, and I wanted to be able to engage with anyone in the community and to kind of be part of that Jewish atmosphere. And I wanted anybody to feel comfortable within my home. And all of that kind of came together to that decision that I made in my life. I started going to shul weekly. And as you probably know, I mean, shuls in Israel and outside of Israel are very different in the sense of what they mean to any Jew. It's not just a place for practice your Judaism. It's also kind of a community center that brings the community together. And I think that sense of belonging, whatever, regardless of what I keep or not keep, or what I was brought up on and what I wasn't, I felt belong. Yeah. For the first time.
You know, it's interesting that you described the Israel that you grew up with as a, not an a la carte choice of Judaism, while in the U.S., even though people are part of denominations, it is a very a la carte experience that everybody sort of picks for themselves. And that in Israel, you're ordering, one entire side of the menu or the other side of the menu. Here in the States, we've talked about, we have this concept of separation of church and state, where, we try not to let religion, it's not supposed to become commingled according to the law, we try. So how is that addressed in Israel? Is that changing? When we spoke, you sort of highlighted some of the issues that even secular Israelis feel strongly about, whether it has to do with stores or travel. But maybe very differently, though, when it comes to, women praying at the Western Wall. But how does that manifest itself, in Israel, and now with you as an adult among maybe some of your friends back in Israel?
Sure. So definitely the whole question of church and state is something that is very much present in the Israeli society, secular and religious alike, but from many different aspects. I think that coming from a very secular society, I think that what most relevant and what bothers them more than anything is how the rabbinical body takes ownership of the way that the Jewish life in Israel look like. So in terms of whether, they're lacking the freedom of traveling on Shabbat on public transportation and being able to shop or dine or hang out or, do all sort of leisure activities during Shabbat, which is our only free day, as we don't have Sundays, unfortunately. So that's a big issue for many people. And so that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, things that I feel like are a big concern of the American Jewish community, and I relate to them very much, issues like women's prayer in the Western Wall, or the definitions of who is allowed to get married and be recognized in Israel, or to adopt children or not, and things like that are also in the control of the rabbinical body. I think that are only of a concern to specific communities within Israel, and not really the general discussion. Again, unfortunately, I think that this kind of issues, and even by the fact that it's that it matters so much to the Jewish communities worldwide, I think that by itself is a good enough reason to give it a big role in on the platforms of decision makers in Israel.
Right.
I think Israel is not only the country of Israelis; it's the only Jewish country in the world, and by that, I believe that we should see any Jew around the world as a potential citizen and an influencer on the way that Israel should be run.
Right. So it sounds like you have sort of gone through your own chrysalis as a caterpillar does, and you've come out a butterfly. And I'm curious if you think of yourself as an Israeli Jew or a Jewish Israeli. Not that there's a right or wrong answer. They mean two different things. You know, which is the descriptor and which is, you know, you at your core, and maybe you're still on the journey of figuring that out. But what do you say today?
So again, I think that if you would have asked me that question a few years back, I would say that being an Israeli or a Jew are two parallel skills that you need to put yourself on either one of them.
Right.
And where I am today, I believe that it's more of a matrix that you need to put yourself somewhere along those boxes and on two dependent skills. So after the journey that I believe that I went through in the past 12 years, I think that today I'm a Jew and Israeli, and not the opposite. And the and is also an essential part of it. I think that I think that being a Jew is a choice, and definitely, you know, living here in America, I think that it's much more of a choice and not something that is part of our nature. And also to be an Israeli, I think that just as much as putting your Jewish identity as part of your life, I think that also an Israeli is just as much of a choice, whether you live in Israel or not. If you live in Israel and you don't put yourself as part of the society and you don't take equal responsibilities and duties in, you know, in the security of Israel, in the social environment, I'm not sure how much your Israeli identity can or your Israeli title can be owned by you or not. And at the same time, not necessarily living in Israel, but supporting Israel, learning about Israel, having Israel present in your life, investing in Israel, visiting Israel, whatever you find as your connection to the land, the country, or the people of Israel, might consider yourself as just as Israeli as many others.
As any other country.
As many other people who might describe themselves as Israelis.
Right, right. So let's turn now a little bit to the more practical side of things. Here you are, you're our new Shliha here in Westchester. You're not alone, you have a team from what we understand. Tell us a little bit more how you're structured here. And we're a very large community. You are the senior Shliha. Who works with you? And you know, we'll sort of give you the floor and let you talk more about what your goals are and what you would like to accomplish here.
So again, I feel extremely fortunate to be here and to be kind of a living bridge between the Westchester Jewish community and Israel. I believe that this connection, I'm not an official representative of my country or my government in any way. I'm more of a representative of my people and the society that I come from. So I'm happy to be able to be here and kind of create those informal connection and interpersonal connections between the community here in Israel. There's so much I want to do and so many dreams that I want to fulfill as part of this role. I'm still learning and I'm still building the infrastructures in order to do that, but thankfully I'm here for a few years, so I have quite some time to fulfill them, definitely with the great partners that I have. And as you mentioned, I'm not here by myself. I'm heading a delegation of Shinshinim that would probably grow more in the next few years. This year we have 4 Shinshinim. Shinshinim are gap year students from Israel who decided to postpone their army in 1 year and do some kind of a communal service. And the Jewish agency Shinshinim chose to do it abroad with the Jewish communities. So I have Gili, Noah, Oad, and Gilad.
What is a Shinshin? I consider my Hebrew to be pretty good, but
you're right. Shinshin, the letters Shin twice, is actually a shortcut of Shnat Shirut, a year of service. So this is where the name comes from. And they are working all across the country in day schools, in Hebrew schools, in synagogues, and youth programs, kind of also bringing Israel to life and to the community life in the most interpersonal way possible. They're doing incredible work and creating connections to the kids and to the teens, and being present in so many different institutions. They are working in almost 20 institutions across the county, and at the same time, only 20 this year. And that's why we believe that this delegation needs to grow more in the future.
Maybe you could just educate us also. Do you and the other shlichim and shinshinim, do you have any interaction or any sort of work educating or going into public schools to talk about Israel? Or is it really only within Jewish communities, Jewish organizations, synagogues, etc.?
So the main mission is within the Jewish communities. But being Israeli representatives in this community, just as those non-Jewish institutions are part of your life, when some of your kids go to public schools and some of your friends are not necessarily Jewish or part of the community, I believe that we definitely have a role within those circles as well. I mean, to educate about Israel, to represent Israel on whatever platform it may be, on a political platform, on the media, and in the education system for sure.
Right. Okay, that's very interesting. So you can be presenting in local high schools, etc., if that were organized by somebody.
Sure.
Okay, interesting. So what's been the most surprising thing that you've noticed since you've been here this time around? I mean, I'm cheating because you already told me what that was, but maybe share with everybody what has been the most surprising thing that you've noticed since you've been around. And I'm going to take the liberty of being the moderator to share with everybody that I have a dog downstairs who had a procedure yesterday who I can hear. I'm just going to go check on her while you answer that question. I'll be right back.
Sure. So actually, there are two things that really surprised me and I found very interesting. One of them is the level of interest and importance that people among this society, among this community, give to the Hebrew language, and just how much parents want their kids to learn Hebrew and want to practice their Hebrew with us. And, you know, just thinking about Hebrew as probably the least spoken language in the world. So such a small beneficial meaning to your personal life and to your professional life, and still having people care so much about it and want to learn so much of Hebrew. So that's one thing that I'm really curious about and very much impressed, and also, you know, makes me feel good that that by itself means a lot about the connection of the Jewish community in Westchester to Israel, that's for sure. And secondly, I think these days specifically, I mean, the way that COVID influenced the community and the society here in Westchester is quite different than how it was in Israel, and how it still is. I mean, we're still in the middle of this global pandemic. So definitely that's another really interesting factor of how the society reacts and handle the pandemic on a social level. I mean, but that's a whole long discussion that we can have maybe another time.
Did you, I know I stepped away for a minute and I apologize. You had mentioned to me that there were some sort of core Israeli events, holidays, activities that you wanted to kind of bring to life in the community a little bit. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Sure. I think that there are so many opportunities to connect to Israel and to bring Israel into the discussion. I mean, only today, I don't know how many of you are aware that this Hebrew date is actually Rabin Memorial Day. And I think that's Rabin heritage. And the lesson that we learned from his murder is something that should be brought up as any kind of Israel education program, wherever it may be, in almost any age, and definitely in any sort of institution. So this is something that we do on different platforms. You're going to see that on our social platforms, on Instagram and Facebook, with the Westchester Shliha that you can look up for, and also the Shinchinim are running Rabin-related activities in the institutions that they work in. Another opportunity that I would like to invite all of you is that an event that we're having on November 3rd, together with all the shlichim across Northeast, for the Sigd holiday. The Sigd is an ancient holiday that was observed in Ethiopia by the Ethiopian Jews for decades, and now is celebrated in Israel mainly by the Ethiopian Jews. So, so it's a fascinating holiday, and obviously the Ethiopian community in Israel has so much to offer and so much issues that that can be brought up only by mentioning that important date for them. So we are having a virtual event on November 3rd at noon. And the link is at WJC's newsletter that was sent out today. And if not, reach out to me and I'll send you a link, and I'll be happy to see you all there.
And what is the meaning of Sigd? Is there a sort of that you can encapsulate for us? Is it commemorated a particular date or a person or an event?
So the Sigd is about the Ethiopian Jews will to be in Israel and to be in Jerusalem specifically. So kind of an aliyah to Jerusalem, but in a different cultural aspect, context that is very, very interesting.
Right.
And they celebrate it every year in Armon HaNativ in Israel with a huge celebration that's worthwhile to be part of next time we'll be in Israel.
That sounds quite interesting and quite fascinating and very worthwhile. I've got a few other questions, but before we exhaust things on our end, let's see if we have anyone else in the group that has any questions for you, Shachar. Anybody in? And
then maybe while people are warming up and thinking about questions, I just want to share with you a very, very short video of our mishlachat for this year, just because I want you to meet our Shinshinim as well and to recognize their faces. And next time you'll see them in your shul or even in the supermarket, just say shalom. So I'm going to share my screen with you.
Thank you.
And you're right, Guy, it's 50 days count from Yom Kippur, the Sigd holiday, absolutely.
Ah.
So this is us.
Fantastic. That was a great video. I'm gonna, can you hear us? We still together? Yes.
Yes,
So let me ask you, if there were, if you could pick 1, 2, or 3 things to sort of energize, Jews here in the U.S. about Israel and Zionism, do you have any innate answers what that might be that you would want to promote or drive home?
Absolutely. I think that my personal passions and what I'm planning on bringing here is 3 main things that I love about Israel, and I think that connect me to the country more than anything. So one of them is the social sector in Israel that I believe can be kind of a lighthouse to the world on how to address social issues and how in an innovative and creative way, and has so much to offer. And that's part of my professional experience, but there's so much that we can talk about and social issues that are very much the same here and in Israel. Secondly is women's leadership, women's entrepreneurship, and innovation in Israel. I think that that's a piece of inspiration that can be very much can serve as a point of relation to Israel and connection for many women and men alike on so many wonderful things that women are doing in Israel society, politics, business, and any other field. And lastly, I just think it's the personal connections that we can have. I mean, just by the few friends that I managed to collect in the couple of months that I've been here, and the shinshinim and the personal connections that they have with the kids, with the teens, and with their host families and anyone else that they meet. I think that's a great way to connect to Israel, just by getting to know its people and to create personal connections. So the Mishlachat is definitely here for that cause, and also to create other connections, not between ourselves, but with so many of our friends and colleagues back at home, based on mutual interests.
Sure. So I'm going to ask you a provocative question, if I may, which is, if, and I have my own thoughts on this, but if there were no Jewish agency, if there were no, I guess, Karen Kayemet, and we have lots of these sort of, non-governmental, quasi-governmental organizations from pre-statehood, would you see the need, though, in any event, for the exact kind of work that you and other shlichim do in the United States?
No doubt. I mean, I have a tremendous appreciation to the work that local organizations are doing in terms of Israel advocacy, Israel education, and connecting the local community to Israel. But at the end of the day, this personal connection, what we can bring from our just personal experience as Israelis growing up and living in Israel for as long as we lived, that's, I think, something that is priceless. And we can see that by the personal connections. I meet all these people that tell me about their friends from, birthright or gap year programs that they did 30, 40, or 60 years ago sometimes, and how those relationships stayed with them for so many years later. And it's not about knowing certain things about Israel history or politics or current events. It's more of the personal connections that you create and what you gain from them. So yeah, that's like we said in the beginning, we are here to bring Israel to life.
Right. So in light of that, maybe you can tell us, well, first of all, actually, before I even ask this, we never got back to your family name story, which I think was very interesting in telling about the nature of Israel. You were going to tell us, I think, about your family name, Liran, So why don't you do that, and then I will get to our last question, at least my last question.
Sure. So actually, my original last name was Zaltzman. That was my dad's father last name, and as I mentioned, a lot of his family had been through the Holocaust. Many of them didn't survive, and very few did. My grandfather had 9 siblings, and he was the last male carrying the name of Zaltzman as his surname. And my dad and his brother were both pilots at the IDF Air Force back in the days. And back then, the IDF wanted their pilots, I mean, that's considered to be quite a prestigious program. They wanted every pilot to have a Hebrew name, Hebrew surname, and not one that will represent the, Eastern Europe, but something that is much more local in Sabra. So they were actually forced to change their last name in order to stay in pilot course. So they sat together and decided that if they're going to be the last Zaltzmans that would, that would kind of end the chain of our Zaltzmans, they might just have a similar name. So they sat together and decided on the name Liran that just kind of resembled their motto in life, I guess, of joy and singing. So that's how Liran came about, and Zaltzman remained in our history.
Well, it's a great story, and I always like exploring the background of people's names. But to wrap up, I want you to think for a second, unless you have an answer for this right, but what would you say is, if you have one, is your sort of your own personal favorite or most memorable Israel experience? A particular trip, the first time you saw some part of Israel, or something you did, or what is your sort of go-to moment? If we woke you up at 2 a.m, what would you blurt out?
There are so many that it's really hard to tell. But maybe I'll choose one, and definitely from serving the army, I have so many to share, and from working with at Israel Education, I have so much to share. But I would actually want to share one from my life as a student in Ben-Gurion University, and I was part of this social program where students worked with local kids, unprivileged kids mostly, in Be'er Sheva and in the area. And I was assigned to work with a 10-year-old girl called Katrin, that is part of a special program of kids of prisoners. Katrin's dad was a Negev Bedouin from the Bedouin town in the south, sorry, and her mom was an Israeli Arab. And her dad was in the Israeli prison at that time for criminal background that he had, and I just remember that one moment, that one meeting that I had with her, just before Pesach, when we sat in a room in our apartment and did homework or played some game. And suddenly her mom called me and asked me to help her wrap all those dishware, because she wanted to bring out the Pesach dishware. And I was confused at first, because she's not even Jewish. She's an Israeli Muslim, that just by living in this society, she decided to respect and to interact in her own capacity. And celebrated Passover much more observantly than what I ever had. So just this kind of the variety among the Israeli society, and I'm not sure what's the English word of the psifas, the kind of all those little
the breadth, the variation and breadth of
yeah, I guess,
the
of the
ways
Israeli
of expressing
society,
yourself.
and how they all come together as a one society, for better and for worse. I think that's something very special and very interesting in Israel.
Well, that's a fascinating anecdote, quite frankly, and a great one to end on. And I would say on behalf of all of us on the call and everybody at WJC and the whole community, we wish you the best of luck, and to you and all the Shinshinim, and frankly, can't wait to spend more time with you over your tenure here. So welcome. Toda rabah lach.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who joined me today, and I hope to see you all in person at a certain point.
Fantastic. All right.
Strong health.
And with that, we're going to conclude our inaugural kickoff session for today. I do want to just make sure everybody knows that we do have the next in our Israel Connection series lined up. We don't have a specific date yet, I don't think, but it will be Nathan Hoffman, or Natan Hoffman, I'm not sure. He is the director of the Galilee Culinary Institute. So stay tuned. Looking forward to getting to know Natan in the next few weeks and introducing him to you next month. Thank you all. Take care.